child in a new country.
Okay, good afternoon, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion today, working on oil painting Death of a Salesman. Garage art, for anyone interested, is canceled today. I overslept and needed a day off, so I'm going to work on this for a little while. So, here we go.
So what was I doing? Well, tell you what I was doing. What's that? I did, but the question is why? Why did I do that? And she did not need that. She did not need me to put her first. What's that? It's an adaptation, absolutely. And here's the deal. If you read my books, you'll notice that I was born in Budapest, Hungary in 1944, to Jewish parents. And this is 2 months before the Germans occupy Hungary. So 2 months before the genocide descends upon the Jews of my country. So I'm 2 months old at the time, and the Wehrmacht, the German army, marches into Budapest. The next day my mother called the pediatrician and says, "Would you please come and see Gabor because he's crying all the time?" And the pediatrician says, "Of course I will come, but I should tell you, all my Jewish babies are crying." So Almas, A.H. Almas, the California-based spiritual teacher, who I think was speaking here this weekend, he says in one of his books, the child is very open and can feel the pain and suffering going on in its immediate environment. The child is aware of its own body and can also feel the tension, rigidity, and pain in the body of the mother or anyone else he's with. If the mother is suffering, the baby suffers too. The pain never gets discharged. So here's what happens. And this is really the core of what I'll tell you the whole day. The child has two needs. The child is an absolute need for attachment. Attachment being loved. I know we talk about attachment in the Buddhist sense, but that's not what I'm talking about right now. Right now I'm talking about the attachment relationship, that dynamic that draws us close to other people. And without that dynamic, without our brains being wired for attachment, we would not survive because simply we're so helpless and utterly dependent as infants. So without somebody taking care of us and us being cute enough that they will want to, which is why as babies we tend to be so cute, you know. And some of us as adults go through life still trying to pretend to be cute. But it's a way of trying to get some love. So without attachment, you don't survive. So that's an absolute need. It's non-negotiable. We have another need. That need is for authenticity. Authenticity, auto, the self. An automobile is a self-propelled mobile. So authenticity has to do with being a true self. And being a true self is not some abstract concept. Being a true self simply means, what am I feeling at the moment? And how can I manifest what I'm feeling? Now, this is a subject of deep psychological exploration. It's very simple. In the wild, if you're not in touch with your gut feelings, you just don't survive. So from the evolutionary perspective, being in touch with the self is absolutely essential. So that's another huge need. Attachment and authenticity. It's terrific. But what happens when, for whatever reason, the environment cannot handle our authenticity? The child is in this dilemma. Am I going to be authentic? Or will I get attachment in my life? For example, your parents can't handle your anger when you're 2-year-old. Or, in my case, I get the message that my mother's already so stressed that if I want to maintain a relationship with her, I better not add to it by having my own pain. Authenticity would be to cry out my pain. I remember being 5 or 6 years old, 4 or 5 maybe, having severe ear infection and very deep, throbbing ear pain in the middle of the night, and just whimpering to myself, and not calling to my mother or father. Oh, that's based on that's an adaptation. Because my mother and father would have wanted me to call them. They would have wanted me to call them. But I got the message in the first months of life not to do that. That's why I adapted. So it's an adaptation. So when we adapt like that, we give up authenticity. And then when we become 40 years old, or 50, or 60, or 35, and you say, I don't know who I am. What's going on? Who's living this life? Because we gave up authenticity as an adaptation. It wasn't a mistake. It's what we have to do. It was brilliant strategy, except it wasn't strategy, because strategy is conscious. We weren't conscious of it. And that's the dilemma in chronic illness. So what I'm saying to you is that all chronic illness represents a surrender of the authentic self. And then the disease comes along to teach us, to come back to ourselves. I'm not recommending it as a way of learning. I'm only saying that when it happens, that's why it happens. And that's what the meaning is. So the quote, James Hollis, virtually all of us lack a deep sense of permission to lead our own lives. We learned very early that the world exacted conditions that, if not met, could result in punishment or abandonment. Only when the ego has reached a certain level of strength, or perhaps more commonly, driven by desperation to make a different choice, can we overthrow the tyranny of history. And that desperation often comes from things that go wrong in our lives, including physical or mental illness. So the meaning of illness is actually to bring us back to ourselves. And that's why metaphors like the war on cancer, and I've been battling cancer for all these years, but that's the word that I always use. So as you battle cancer bravely, but consider that the issue is not to battle it. I'm not saying not to get it treated. I'm talking about the attitude we take towards it. If we see it as an enemy and we battle it, we create a certain energy about ourselves. If we actually see it as something that happened to teach us something, we may still wish to get treated for it, but we will take an utterly different relationship to ourselves and to the illness in the process. And if we actually are willing to learn what it has to teach us, we might have a much more happy outcome, and even if the outcome is physically not any different, we'll be at much more peace with it. Let me read you something here. This is an email I got from a friend of mine who is doing research at Johns Hopkins University with psilocybin, which is magic mushrooms, of course. And the research is about helping people at the end of life with psychotherapy under the influence of psychedelic substances, in this case psilocybin. So my friend writes, here's a session report from an apparently lower dose session, talking about a dose of psilocybin, which I thought was pretty relevant, pretty sweet, from a 45-year-old Georgian man with lymphoma, which he was first diagnosed with in his late 20s. So this is the patient report. The first 3 hours of laying on the couch with the eye mask and the headphones produced a profound spiritual experience that I do not believe would have been possible without the assistance of psilocybin and the support of my friend. I realized that although my cancer is in remission due to the chemo treatments and the stem cell transplant, I envisioned my body left like a gray dead skeleton, and I had not spiritually made a full recovery. This was the point that I realized that I could not achieve the spiritual connection to God with the world around me unless I could once again open my mind and my heart to appreciate the simple gifts of life, like the smile and the laughter I lost. At that point, I laughed out loud, and I shared that it would be just as unrealistic to expect my six-month-old grandson to stand up and start running before being able to walk, as it would be for me to have a spiritual connection to God that I had lost due to my resentment I felt over having to battle cancer once again, until I was ready to make the baby steps of appreciating daily laughter and smiles. I now realize that I am in control of my ability to forge a deeper spiritual connection by appreciating each day as the gift it is. Now it took the cancer, and it took him accepting the cancer and the teaching to get to that point. He was able to do that with the help that he received, but that's what the illness came to teach him in the first place. And how many of you, either in your personal life or for yourself, or have known others who've had significant illness, and in the end would end up saying, it's the best thing that ever happened to me? Have you had that experience? Yeah. Well, that's what people are talking about. People are talking about that. What is the best thing? Almost talks about the self as the precious pearl. So that what actually happens is that the illness comes along and helps you find that precious pearl of your true self. And that's higher than anything else. And it's actually something that even people terminally ill will say they're so glad to have found, even if it means they have to die. Because that's what Jesus calls the eternal life. I'm sorry? Okay, now you know, let's get you the mic so we can hear you. Just say that again. No, hold it. Mic is not on yet. Mic is still on.
Bilingual, 73 years young, and I couldn't understand the last part that you say about Jesus. If whoever believes in him calls eternal life. Could you give a little more information about that, please?
About what, sorry?
Jesus statement that.
In eternal life?
Yes, thank you.
So, here's a Jewish guy on Easter Sunday. Trying to tell you what Jesus meant about eternal life. I'll tell you what I think it means. It means the life that wasn't given to us. The life that we didn't develop as a way of trying to survive. It means the life that was us to start with. Before we began to adapt. Before we gave up our connection with planet stuff. It means the life that is not identified with any particular aspect of us. It means the life that isn't identified with the particular body shape I have right now. Thank God, because that body shape is going to go south very soon. It isn't the life that thinks that it's my thoughts or the emotions I'm having at the moment. That's what's eternal. Okay, you're welcome. Thank you. So, now the question is, how do these patterns that I described to you then lead to illness? By the way, let me just stop here for a minute and thank you for pioneering the questioning. Are there any questions or comments at this point from anybody? And yeah, please put your hand up and the mic will come to you.
Yes, so what about the so-called inherited diseases? Because I am developing 3 of them: high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and blood sugar problems. My grandfather was a diabetic who injected insulin. So how is that related to this sort of end point of a multi-generational emotional process?
Okay, well, I'll grant that there's some people who inherit genes that predispose to certain illnesses. So one of them is in my family. I mentioned it, muscular dystrophy. My aunt had it, my mother had it, one of my brothers has it. When you get the gene with that condition, you're pretty much going to get the disease. Those diseases are extraordinarily rare. You may see them 1 to 10,000 in the population. So they include Huntington's chorea. They include muscular dystrophy of various kinds. There are some others. There are also genes that make it more likely you're going to get breast cancer. And so that's what I mentioned with Angelina Jolie. However, if you look at 100 women with cancer, only 7 have the gene. 93 do not. And out of 100 women with the gene, not all of them will get the cancer. So the diseases where the gene specifically determines that you're going to get the illness are very, very, very rare. Now, I don't know, I don't know whether your genes for high blood pressure. The fact that your grandfather had it and then you had it doesn't tell me that you necessarily have a gene. If you look at the, I mean, you might, but that would be very rare. Most cases of high blood pressure have nothing to do with genetics. And if you look at the very word for high blood pressure, well, what do we call high blood pressure in medical terms? Think about it. Hypertension. Maybe there's too much tension in your life. Maybe there's been too much tension in your life from the very beginnings of your life. Maybe your mother had a lot of tension from the moment you were conceived. And there's what? Abuse, yeah, that's what I'm talking about. So, and I'll talk about the physiology of it a little bit later, in fact very soon, of how this translates into physiology. But if you're asking, is it genetic? I'm saying likely it's not. If you're saying, is it transgenerational? Yes, it is. So stress and trauma are multi-generational. There are some diseases that are genetically multi-generational, but very rare. Very rare. And most illnesses we're talking about are not based on genetics. And sometimes, and very often, even if there's a gene that might predispose, it doesn't mean you're going to get the illness. It still depends on the environment. Because genes are turned on and off by the environment, which is called epigenetics. Let me give you a very interesting example. Not of an illness, but of a behavior. In New Zealand, they did a study of people who were violent, for violence. They looked at a certain number of people for degrees of violence. And some people were found to be very violent, and these people had a certain gene, a genetic difference. But the interesting thing was that in the same population, there were also people who were less violent than average, and they had the same gene as the very violent people. So you had the same gene, and it usually meant you could be less violent or more violent. So the gene was not for violence. What do you think it might have been for? Well, it turned out that the people that were less violent were brought up in very nurturing homes. The people that were violent were brought up in abusive homes. And what that meant is that the gene was for sensitivity to the environment. So when bad things happened, they were more sensitive to that, and it made them more aggressive. And when they were nurtured and dealt with peacefully, they were very sensitive to that, and they became more peaceful than ever. So genes create sensitivities. They very rarely lead to specific diseases or specific behaviors. Well, it turns out, any other questions we have? Yeah, and the mic over there.
I want to ask specifically about diseases that comes with genes that are very connected to genes. Like molecular degeneration.
Okay.
Or other.
Okay.
In my family we have autoimmune or different. I feel that especially in this kind of disease there is a strong connection to the psychological genetics that you get, what you carry. Because even if you have the gene, it doesn't mean that you're 100% going to have the disease.
That's the point.
So, especially in these illnesses that so many people in the family carry, there's so much psychological issues.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So because something runs in a family, it says nothing about genetics. Because you can pass on the same psychological stresses and traumas from one generation to the next. So family history, multiple generations of illness, tells us nothing about genetics. And as you say, even if you have the gene, it doesn't mean you get the disease. So it still depends upon what turns the gene on or what turns the gene off. And autoimmune illnesses, while you can certainly show some genetic predisposition, you cannot show that they're transmitted genetically. Because to show that they're transmitted genetically, everybody with the gene would have to get the disease, and they don't. So the question is then what, and this is what we have to understand, not so much for the purpose of this conversation, but in the medical, is that genes that
Those
turn
tubes have
on
been
and off
sitting
by
for
the
a minute.
environment.
Just got some new paints and they're beautiful, but
So
a
the
little jumpy right out of the cap.
genes, rather than determining things, genes actually are turned on and off. They're governed by the environment. And that science is called epigenetics. Epigenetics studies how genes are modulated by the environment. And I could talk to you a lot about that, but I won't at the moment. A question here? Will I talk about genetics?
No.
Well, what would you like me to say about it?
What I wanted to ask you is, in the idea of epigenetics, turning gene expression on and off,
Yeah.
do you feel that perhaps you have turned off a genetic expression for muscular dystrophy? Or can one do that?
Well, it's interesting. I'm not sure that I know the answer. To tell you the answer, I have to be genetically tested for muscular dystrophy, and I have not been. I've been clinically examined. I was told that by my age, if I had it, I'd be showing some signs of it. But theoretically, your question is absolutely valid, and the only way I'd find out is if I underwent the genetic testing. A friend of mine is a world-famous researcher in Huntington's chorea, which is what Woody Guthrie died with. And Arlo, as you know, does not have the gene. He said that in Huntington's, if you get the gene, your risk of getting the disease is 99%. But that means that 1% out of 100 who's got the gene who's not going to have the disease. Well, there's got to be something epigenetic going on. So I don't know in my case what the situation is. I rather suspect I don't have the gene. I hope for the sake of my children that I don't. I suppose I could get tested for it to know for sure, but more likely I don't. Certainly in a more common case, such as breast cancer, where there are these genes, these breast cancer genes, which most people with breast cancer do not have. But there's some that do,
Check on
and
my
it was
cat.
still not all
Jason's
disease.
awfully pissed.
Well, there has to be something epigenetic there. There has to be something that turned the gene on in some people and didn't turn it on in other people. Yeah.
Thank you. I think I can speak to this a little bit personally, the medical phenomenon, because I'm the first in my family to have RA, juvenile RA, and juvenile degenerative disc disease. And through, genetic testing, I found out that I had the gene, and basically with a lot of intense emotional treatment, a lot of dietary treatment and spiritual revelations and stuff, my RA symptoms have gone down. But the problem is that medical doctors reject the progress, and they reject the, what my body's been through, and basically compartmentalize it. Well, we don't understand how that works, but just keep doing what you're doing.
So why is that a problem?
Well, it's not a problem, but I think part of the reason why we don't commonly hear of it is because there's not enough doctors that are willing to
Yeah, sure.
look at the
Let me
conundrum.
tell you a story. Okay, thanks for that comment. Are you complete? Are you complete with what you're going to say? Okay, great. Well, let me tell you a story then. Nasruddin, have you heard of Nasruddin? Nasruddin being this Sufi sage and mullah and fool, that in all of his adventures and stories there's always a teaching. And sometimes he's wise and sometimes he's a fool. But it's all about what can you learn. So Nasruddin's got this donkey, and his neighbor comes over and says, Nasruddin, can I borrow your donkey just for one day? And Nasruddin says, yeah, I'd love to lend you my donkey, and you're my favorite neighbor, and there's nothing I wouldn't do for you. But it just so happens, though, unfortunately, my brother took the donkey to market just this morning.
Okay.
Neighbor says, oh, okay, well, thank you. And as he starts to walk out of the yard, the donkey brays in the barn next door to him. And the neighbor says, Nasruddin, just a minute. If your brother took the donkey to market, then what was that? Nasruddin says, well, who are you going to believe? Me or that stupid donkey? Okay? Well, in this case, who are you going to believe? You want experience? Your experience is the donkey here. The doctors are Nasruddin denying your experience. Who are you going to believe? let them have their, they do what, like, they do what they can do for you, and that was probably helpful to you,
All right.
and they can't do what they can't see.
All right. Well, that gets a pretty nice, colorful layer in there. I like that. I meant to get a driblet of white to highlight those distant horizon-ish street lamps, but got a glob. New paint's pretty jumpy out of the tube. I think it's been sitting around a while, but it's a beautiful new set. I can't remember the brand name on it right now, or I'd plug it just for the consistency, opacity, and variety of colors and the value of the set. It was not that expensive for a good amount of good paint. So anyway, very pleased with that.
And we're looking just at like
So that sets up another pretty nice layer, which after it sets up will be reglazed probably with a very thin yellow, and then retooled a little bit just to give it all a bit more fog. But I like the level of detail now, and the variety of colors is starting to bring it to life, I think. So, but that's it for the moment. So thank you for watching. That's Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting The Death of the Salesman. Zoom in on those distant streetlights. They're kind of nice. Gives the whole thing a little bit more of a depth and sort of starts abstracting the distance.
That trying to find the cause of cancer inside the individual cell is like trying to understand a traffic jam by studying the internal combustion engine.
All right. Have a good day, Earth.